Welcome to another edition of EGAP's election series, where we bring together researchers and local experts to discuss and share their views on upcoming and recent elections. Today, we're talking about the upcoming municipal elections in South Africa, which are taking place on November 1st. My name is Max Mendes-Beck. I'm the Meetings and Membership Manager at EGAP, and I'm excited to be joined today for this discussion by Evan Lieberman, Rorisang Lekalake, Hugo van der Merwe, and Tshegofatso Putu. Evan Lieberman is member of the EGAP network and the Total Professor of Political Science and Contemporary Africa at MIT. He's also just written a book on democracy in post-apartheid South Africa titled Until We Have Won Our Liberty, which will be out in May of next year through Princeton University Press. So welcome, Evan. Rorisang Lekalake is a PhD candidate in comparative politics and political economy at MIT. Her current research focuses on the role of land and inequality in shaping political attitudes and behavior in South Africa. She received her master's in political science at the University of Cape Town before working at Afrobarometer. Welcome. Hugo van der Merwe is a senior research specialist at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation in South Africa, which is an organization that forms part of the EGAP network. There, he develops and manages various research, advocacy, and intervention projects relating to transitional justice in South Africa and the African continent. He is also the co-editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Transitional Justice. Tshegofatso Putu is a Kader Asmal Fellow and Master's in Philosophy student in International Peace Studies at the Trinity College in Dublin. She also has a Master of Commerce and Development Economics from the University of Cape Town. Her research focuses on utility privatization, service delivery, and the effects of neoliberal economic policies on interpersonal violence and crime in South Africa. So I want to welcome everybody. Evan has agreed to moderate this discussion today. So I guess I'll just hand things off to you, Evan.
Great, thanks, Max. Great to be here with you and Rory, Hugo, and Tsego. And thanks to EGAP for hosting this event to discuss the upcoming election. So let me start with a question that might be on some people's minds if they're listening in, particularly people that don't follow South African politics too closely, which is, why are we even gathering here to talk about a local election, right? There was a peaceful, in many ways, kind of run-of-the-mill for South Africa national election in 2019. And as it's done in every national election since 1994, majority of the electorate went for the ANC. And although, somewhat diminished, the balance of national and provincial power stayed really just as it's been, for several decades now. And here in the United States, where I'm sitting, local elections are kind of humdrum affairs. And if they're ever bitterly contested, well, it's about some very, very local rivalry in one town or city that's mostly unrelated to the national picture, and it's quite separate. So Rory, can you start us off by saying something about the local electoral contest in South Africa that puts into perspective what's going on and why, for example, the president of South Africa is out there campaigning for local elections?
Thanks very much, Evan. Well, as you yourself said, local elections are, of course, supposed to be about local issues. And there are a lot of very important issues that are on the line at that level. But the distinction between local and national level issues is very much blurred in South Africa. Often voters are unclear about which responsibility falls to which level of government. And political parties also tend to blur the lines between the local and national level in their own campaigning. Local elections are very important, also because they provide opposition parties an opportunity to demonstrate their governance effectiveness at the subnational level, which is really crucial in a context like South Africa that has one party that is extremely dominant at the national level. They're also quite unique in relation to provincial and national votes because of their institutions and timing. Firstly, in terms of institutions, voters are able to directly elect their ward councillors as opposed to using proportional representation. So they had the chance to directly reward or punish their representatives based on their performance. Also, in terms of their timing, they come 2 years after national votes, which means that voters are also given the opportunity to signal any dissatisfaction that they might have with the ANC. And this seems to be borne out when we look at the electoral data. The ANC vote share tends to be lower overall in local elections, and there was the largest drop occurred between the 2014 national election and the previous municipal election in 2016. So I think that's why you'll see that national level players, including the president himself, take these elections extremely seriously.
Great. Yeah, so we had just in 2019 these provincial and national elections. That's at the same time we have coming up on November 1 these local elections. But maybe we should talk about where things left off in the last local election, which was back in 2016. And for this, Hugo, I'm going to turn to you to ask how did that one go? And no small question here, what's been the state of local government since then?
Local government is in many ways where things really fall apart in South Africa. It is where the real service delivery is supposed to happen in terms of electricity, water, roads. And I think that's where people are particularly unsatisfied with the performance of government. And they blame they don't know who to blame. And I think that's where the confusion comes in. It's all the political, whoever's in power who gets blamed for that, no matter who's kind of in charge really locally. And at that level, I think there's also from the political parties, there's also this at stake, the issue of controlling municipalities, which means controlling certain budgets, controlling, having basically in control of contracts. That is where a lot of the corruption does happen, and a lot of the favors that political parties can hand out, where they can build up their support base. And until recently, they are funding for their parties, where now we have a bit more transparency in party funding, so that those funds are also drying up. But essentially, the local elections, as with the national elections, is where things turn. The violence is around intra-party and fights over positions rather than between parties, and I think that's where we see it's a pattern that we see in every local election, and that's continuing in this one as well.
Great. Well, I want to get to violence in a few minutes, but one thing I wanted to talk about first, just so we have the context of this election, is the electoral results from 2016, because in some ways, that was a really big election. If we think back that 1994 was the first multiracial election in South Africa, what we really think of as the dawn of democracy in South Africa. And the ANC was overwhelmingly dominant for much of that time. Not everywhere, not in every province, not in every locality, but 2016 really ushered in a lot of electoral moxie on other political parties. Maybe it was their strength, maybe it was the ANC's weakness. Either way, we saw this big decline, and there were a lot of coalition governments that emerged out of that, because at the local level, just like at the provincial and national level, it's essentially like a parliamentary system, and in order to decide who's going to be mayor, you need a majority of the sitting councillors. So I don't know if any of the panelists, so Hugo, I think if you want to finish up on what you were just talking about in terms of service delivery, could you tell us a little bit about how coalition government has gone at the local level? Because it certainly could be a harbinger for what coalition government could be at the national level, or maybe it just tells us something about local government.
Well, firstly, there were 3 metropolitan areas that were kind of taken over by the DA from the ANC in coalition partnerships with other opposition groups. And essentially, those coalitions have not gone well. There have been major fallouts between the political parties. Since then, the DA's lost control of 2 of those municipalities to new coalitions. So essentially, the coalition politics in South Africa, I don't think the parties are ready for it. There's too much animosity. There's a level of secrecy and mistrust within politics that makes it very difficult to maintain these coalitions. And I think that's also we'll see new collaborations emerge in this next election. But for now, it doesn't look like a very feasible form of government where, I think there isn't the level of political maturity amongst these parties. There's internal strife in the parties that makes it very difficult for them to maintain solid relationships externally. And I think the DA has been particularly have internal leadership wrangles that have spilled out into party dynamics as well.
Great. So Tsego, I want to get you in here. Can you tell us a little bit? Hugo's talking about a few parties, the DA, we've mentioned the ANC. Again, many of the people who are going to be listening to this might not be so familiar with South African politics. And I don't expect you to talk about all of them, but there are, by my count, over 300 parties competing in this election with some pretty wild names. Can you tell us a little bit about who are the main players and actors competing in this local election?
Cool, yeah. So we have the African National Congress, which is the Liberation Party and has been in power, majority power, since 1994, which was the elections to the new democratic South Africa. And then we have the Democratic Alliance, which has been the opposition, the official opposition, until I think the last 2 elections where we saw the economic freedom fighters emerge as another challenger, and they were made up of a break of people who were in the ANC. So the ANC Youth League, some leading members of the ANC Youth League had a coalition and became the economic freedom fighters. And their politics are to do with the land, and they claim to be representative of the working class in South Africa. So if you see in Parliament, how they represent themselves is wearing, what domestic workers in South Africa have a uniform that they wear. So that's what they wear. And people who work in the garden and who paint, they wear overalls. And this is how the EFF represents itself. And the Democratic Alliance has been seen as the representative of the white minority and some of their leading issues. And then you have also other breakoffs. So the Freedom Front Plus, which is a breakoff of different Afrikaans nationalist, I'd say, organizations. And then you have smaller parties as well they're all emergent from the same space. A lot of the parties are coming off from the ANC, disgruntled members of the ANC, and disgruntled members of the DA as well. In the Western Cape, there's a party called Good. So it's just, most of the parties have similar objectives, just having breakoffs at some points and then organizing around those. So that would be I'd say the landscape. We have an introduction of smaller parties, I'd say, that are more in these local government elections, more community issue based. In the Western Cape, a lot of them are aligned to identity politics that we've seen. So yeah, it's an interesting election coming up, and one moving towards parties that are more identity based as well.
Great. Now, one can wonder, again, from an American perspective, if you want to get into political office, forming a small party is usually not the way to do it. But as Rory explained, since, while it's true that at the constituency level, it's a single member system, it's also a proportional representation system in terms of how the council gets elected. So it would seem that you've got a lot of individuals and factions who are thinking, well, maybe I can be the kingmaker, right, for this for this election. Have any of you gotten a sense of that? Is it that small parties are arising because they're hoping that they'll be at the razor's edge of the difference between 49% and 51%, or do people just want expression in the municipalities? I don't know, Hugo, you any thoughts on that, or Rory?
I think just briefly to say that, I mean, firstly, there's certain people who just are pushing very single issue agendas, who want to make sure that that gets taken, that there's a voice for it, without any serious kind of anticipation of being very powerful. But just I think there's a certain need for just a voice for people where there's three dominant parties, and it almost obscures any other debates within this process. And it's a very kind of staged process. I think there's almost, people generally are desperate just for something new in this environment. Then there's, I think but generally the coalitions will be amongst the main, in the metropolitan areas, will probably include the main parties, and the smaller parties won't have much of a say. But there's also the possibility, and this happened in Cape Town, where the DA for a number of years governed in coalition with a number of small parties. So it wasn't a kind of, it was a sense that they had to align themselves with some of the issues raised by the small parties, but ultimately the DA had such strong control and now they have even more dominant control. So I think there's a certain sense of the bigger parties will swallow the smaller ones in these processes. The kingmaker process might work in small municipalities, but not so much in the big ones.
Great. Rory, anything to add?
Yeah, I think just to briefly add to what Hugo said, it's been interesting to see the way that the larger parties have responded to the way things fared in the previous election, namely in the way that the DA in particular, I believe, has shifted or introduced messaging aimed at discouraging voters from supporting some of these smaller parties because of concerns of these kind of issues, that they would be forced into coalition politics. And so that has also been interesting to see how they've done that, and how that the ANC in particular has absorbed some of the really popular platforms of parties like the EFF into their own agenda.
Great. I'll just say, as Max mentioned, I've just finished a book about South Africa post-apartheid democracy with a focus on one municipality, Mogale City local municipality, which is a kind of on the urban periphery bordering Johannesburg. And in 2016, for the first time, the ANC just lost getting a majority, and all of the other parties, ranging from the FF Plus, which Tsego pointed out is kind of an Afrikaner nationalist party, to the EFF, which is, if you could think of the exact opposite, a kind of almost black nationalist party, along with the IFP, a Zulu-based party, and then the DA, a more kind of market-oriented, formerly white liberal party, basically got into coalition and said, anything but ANC. And it was a really tough time. And less than 2 years into it, the ANC somehow convinced a couple of councillors to go along with them in a vote of no confidence, and they got the mayor out and then got a new ANC mayor in. So, but they did this under the kind of cloak of secrecy, and strangely enough, the election, which initially produced a coalition government, wound up producing an ANC government. So lots of strange things can happen in electoral politics in South Africa. One interesting new addition, it seems like I've heard about, is the rise of independent candidates. Now that, of course, isn't going to be the case at the level of proportional representation. That there, you have to vote for a party, but these ward councillors. So Tsego, what's your sense? It looked to me, I looked at this huge, massive nominations list, and there's, it's a small percentage, but about 1.5% of the candidates are independent. And, did they have a shot in what's going on there?
Yeah, I think because of the nature of local government elections, and as the other speakers have said, they deal with water, electricity, which have become a problem in South Africa, increasingly a problem, right? And has moved into metros as well. People want to see their next door neighbor who is going through the same issues on the ballot, right? I think it's more believable. As Rorisang has said, people have become disenchanted with the government, and also it's so far away. Well, I mean, they're representatives who are in political parties and have agendas and ideologies that might not align to the community ideologies. So I think that the rise of independence is something that might be very important, and that I think that people would steer towards voting for independence, although it's also difficult as an analyst to make projections about this, because independent candidates are very new in South Africa. So we don't know how it will go, but I think intuitively, with how people feel about politics and service delivery, they're more likely to vote for their next door neighbor and someone that they know and trust, and they know will be accountable and doesn't have a bigger agenda. So that's my feel towards independence.
Great, thanks a lot. So Rory, I want to turn to you. You know, for a lot of students of African politics, they're used to thinking about voting in terms of ethnic parties or clientelism. I've heard a lot of all of you talking about issues, about service delivery, about land, and so in some ways, maybe, you know, this is a good thing, right? I mean, I think we usually think that a democracy is richer when it's based on programmatic parties and platforms. Would you say that's fair? Is South African politics? I mean, but you know, in fairness, I've also heard, you know, we've mentioned Afrikaner nationalists. They only get a small percentage of the vote, but there's certainly some identity politics for sure, and we know that there's a pretty high correlation between race, ethnicity, and voting support in South Africa, but far from a perfect one. So, you know, my question to you is local elections in South Africa about programmatic politics? And if so, what do you see as being the major issues on the ballot in this election?
Well, I think that there, at least in terms of official campaigning, there definitely seems to be a lot of agreement that these elections should be about issues, and also a certain sense of consensus on what those issues, what the important issues and challenges are. There is a lot of talk of improving service delivery in general, quite broadly, tackling financial mismanagement, and just essentially delivering, you know, broadening access to all sorts of different services, improving on what is already out there for South Africans. I think what becomes a little bit difficult, as Toho mentioned, is the fact that there are elements of identity politics that are dog whistled at times in this campaigning. It's not just when you have like outright Afrikaner nationalist parties, or with the EFF, who are on opposite ends of the spectrum, who on the one hand, on the EFF side, are clearly stating that they believe that white farmers should have their land expropriated for the Black majority. On the Freedom Front side, they talk about an end to affirmative action. But you have also subtler campaigning that has happened on the part of the DA. Most controversially, they had campaign posters that had the potential to stoke existing tensions between the Black and Indian populations in KwaZulu-Natal. So I think that while there definitely has been a lot of talk of the issues and consensus on what those issues are, the media has rightly pointed out that a lot of the campaigning has turned into kind of a bad politics election, in which parties are really, you know, capitalizing on these grievances and resentments for their own benefit.
So one big issue that I can't believe we haven't talked about yet is COVID. I mean, South Africa has had a pretty massive COVID epidemic by any standard, certainly by the standards of what we've observed on the African continent. So Rory, what do you think? How big of an issue is the government's response to COVID? Is it going to be a referendum on local governments' responses or something else? And also, do you think people are going to be safe voting in this election?
I think in terms of people's response to the government's action so far, it seems like for the most part, at least, they seem to have high ratings of the overall response, but there's definitely some grievances regarding perceived unfairness in the distribution of COVID-related relief funds and perceived corruption in the disbursement of those funds. So there's definitely an underlying tension between wanting to reward the government for doing a fairly good job considering how grave the issue was, but at the same time, it seems to be really undermining pre-existing trust in the government, in the leadership, in institutions. And I think where this can have grave results is in turnout, because now voters will not only have to face whether or not they feel motivated to go out and vote and participate, but also whether they feel safe doing so in person. And that has been complicated by the fact that the the Independent Electoral Commission had a report that highlighted the risks involved in doing so. And there has basically been a bit of tension between different parts of the government and different political parties in whether or not it really is safe to do so. So I think there's been a lot of mixed messages.
Great. Yeah, I mean, and we should highlight that the Independent Electoral Commission actually, didn't want this election to take place on November 1, right? They tried to push it into they went to the court and said, we'd really like to postpone this election, but the court basically came back and said, no, sorry, you got to have this election, on basically the 5-year timetable that we always have elections. So they're doing it. So I want to talk about an issue, sorry to be American centric, but that's how Americans are when we talk about foreign politics. Here in my country, we have this disgraced former president showing up and inserting himself in all sorts of electoral contests. And South Africa seems to have something quite the same in your President Zuma. And you may or may not want to, you don't like it when I call him your President Zuma, just the way I might not refer to the guy I'm talking about as my former president. But, the parallels between these two guys are pretty amazing, right? They both got elected despite well-known sexual scandals. Both involved in lots of corrupt deals while in office, both sought to enrich themselves, but both were removed through more or less democratic processes. And yet they're both casting a really big shadow on politics today. And that's really true in this local election and what's gone on the past couple of months. So Hugo, can you tell us a little bit about the role that Jacob Zuma is playing in South African politics over this past year and how that relates to this election?
Yeah, well, essentially, in Zuma's role in politics, I mean, he was the president until fairly recently, and essentially, the two factions within the ANC are, broadly speaking, the Cyril Ramaphosa faction and the Zuma faction, and it's an ongoing battle. It's not just about the two individuals; it is about the whole slate of candidates that have been vying for senior positions in government or control of the ANC party. So essentially that has been an ongoing battle since before Zuma started, and for a while Zuma's faction held sway, and now Cyril's faction hold sway. And that's been it's been a dirty fight all the way through. But essentially now it's taken on a new level of urgency, because essentially Cyril Ramaphosa has said, we're willing to to take this all the way through the courts to ensure that people who've committed acts of corruption are sent to jail. So it's not simply a fight over who controls the resources, it's actually a fight for survival. And for certain ANC leaders to stay out of jail, and that's really increased the the stakes to the. So when in this particular situation, Zuma was found to be in contempt of court because he wouldn't cooperate with a commission that was investigating corruption. The Constitutional Court found him in contempt, and he was sentenced to jail. And that was what that triggered, basically a fight back, an escalation in the fight back that the Zuma supporters took to the streets and organized very targeted violence, but also fanned popular expression of violence that escalated into looting of shopping malls, and essentially in trying to turn a targeted insurrection into a populist response to the dominant ANC faction. And in some ways, that is kind of deeply concerning that so many people did participate, that there was, I think, sufficient disillusionment with basically our social contract, that the social contract in South Africa is something that there isn't a sense that this is a society that cares for people, and particularly during COVID, where so many people have been so deeply not affected by COVID, but affected by the lockdown. So we have a situation where there's a kind of, it's a very volatile in terms of what people can be, how people can be mobilized around these disenchantment with the present government. And the political leaders know how to play into those sentiments.
Great, thanks. Earlier Hugo made reference to violence, right? South Africa has long been a violent country. It was violent during apartheid. It was violent during the transition away, and there's been a fair bit of violence since then. But there does seem to be something of an uptick in violence in recent months around nominations and this election. So Tsego, I just want to ask you, do you see this as kind of run-of-the-mill South African violence, or should we be concerned that this is a new level or anything's getting out of hand? And can you shed any light for us on how we should think about violence in the electoral context in South Africa?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that the violence that we've noticed is not necessarily notable. In fact, in the research that I've been doing, we see that the violence that is around political, violence has decreased from 2018. So the South African Police Services and the Interministerial Committee for Political Killings and some independent organizations have put out reports that show that there has been a downward trend since 2018. So I think another important aspect in terms of violence, political violence in South Africa, most of it is concentrated in KwaZulu-Natal. And that has been a trend from the 1980s because of internal factions in that province as well. So that has been really the hotspot of violence in the country, political violence. And we've seen that in that province as well, there has been a decrease. So in 2016, which was the last local government election, we saw that there were 31 political murders versus now in the first half of 2021, which is an election year as well, there have been 4 political correlated murders. So we have seen a decline. And this is in the context of a country that, as you said, Evan, there's a lot of political killings. So I think that this downward trend is something that is positive. I've seen somewhere that people are saying that because of COVID-19 and branches and political movements not being able to meet physically has contributed to the decline. Not sure about that explanation, but I think COVID has affected a lot in terms of governance and organizing. So that could be why the number has decreased significantly. So yeah, that's what I would say about the political induced murders so far in this election year. Not sure if anyone has anything else to add.
No, all right. Well, let me say thank you for the positive, the somewhat positive take on things in South Africa, because I actually happen to be pretty bullish about South Africa. South Africans always tend to focus on all of the negative things going on, and I get it because there are a lot of challenges and problems. But I also think that if we look over the longer term and we see, how these elections are being contested, in vigorous democratic form, there's a lot of positive that could be taken from it, particularly when we look in a kind of comparative and historical perspective. But for sure, it's going to be a hard-fought election, and I want to end by getting predictions from all of you. You weren't prepared for this, but they'll be easy ones. And let's see if we can see on two big questions. The first question is this going to be an uptick or a downtick for the ANC in terms of how they do nationally in local elections? And then the second is going to be on turnout. Turnout was great in 2016, but then it was pretty poor in 2019. Now, it was pretty bad weather in 2019, as I recall. It's hard to know, but the predictions were that the turnout was going to be bad, and it was. And that's important. It's still a young democracy. So question one, is the ANC going to do better, worse, or the same as it did in the last election? And question two, how is turnout going to be? Better, worse, the same? And of course, you could just guess. It's not that many things, but we want to be real informed. You're informed, sophisticated, based on lots of data and models, predictions. All right, who wants to start? I'm gonna go back to you, Tsego. What do you think? ANC, are they going to do better or worse in this election?
I think that they might surprise everyone and do the same. So not have an outright majority, but also not lose by a large number. So I think that it might be in the same position where it's like just below the majority vote, so 49% or between like 46 and 49%. That's what I expect, just based on some of the data that I've seen very recently, and like computer assisted telephone interviewing that I read a study very recently about that was conducted in the last week of August. So just based, of course, it wasn't very, the demographic wasn't very wide,
right.
But I was surprised at that, and I think that we might be surprised again. So,
and what about turnout, especially among young people? As you're a young person, and they've been the worst everywhere. Is it turnout going to be increased, the same, or depressed?
I think also the ANC has a new strategy where they've deviated from like their older classic candidate who's a cadre, to a young candidate who speaks to issues like LGBTQI, and that's what we've seen. So I think they're trying to convince people like that, and all of the other parties also seem to be running people who are more relevant. So the EFF, of course, is a young party, and the issue-based parties are running people that are more direct to them. So I think we might see the youth participate, although that's one of the least reliable demographics across the world, I guess. So yeah, I think there might be some people showing up, but I don't think we'll see large changes from the other years. And also one more thing, I do think that there'll be more rural participation in those who are in the metro, because I think that their grievances during this COVID time, as mentioned by everyone else as well, they've had more grievances, and I think they need more urgent change than everyone else. Just intuitively, having seen how COVID affected the rural population more, I guess. So yeah, that's some of my predictions.
Great. All right, Hugo, I'll turn to you. What do you think? How's the ANC going to do, and what's turnout going to look like?
Well, I think firstly, all the main political parties are going to do worse. And none of them are doing enough to I think, inspire or to show that they're going to do anything different. They're all still in falling into, I think, the perception that they're not dealing with the key concerns that people have about them. They can't expand beyond their existing support base. I think there's going to be a gradual increase maybe in the small parties. But I think, and that's my guess, is mainly where people have name recognition. And I think it's that question: is this someone who's known in the community, either from being a councillor for a big party or having some other profile in that community? And that's going to vary from one town to the next. There's some places where nobody's standing up with who has a serious profile, so it's not going to have any impact in those areas. And I think there's still a serious disillusionment with politics. I think the biggest problem with democracy in South Africa is that people are losing faith in the democratic process, and they're turning to other forms of protest rather than voting. So voting is almost there's more a sense of why vote, and I think that's the biggest challenge. So I'm hoping for an increase in turnout, because I think we really need to hold on to this privilege this right that we fought for, that we shouldn't be retreating from.
Great. Last word from you, Rory. What do you think?
I think that in general, what we might see is that people's underlying preferences for the different parties have not necessarily changed that much between 2019 and today, and what will affect the overall results is your second question, which is that of turnout. Who makes it to the polls, who doesn't? And that's partly will be a result, of course, of political parties' ability to turn out their particular voting constituencies. But my concern is that the unprecedented situation of COVID will amplify existing inequality among the South African electorate and lead to disparities in voting based on who's able to, either because they feel comfortable voting and have gotten vaccines, or perhaps because of socioeconomic considerations.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for sharing your views and informed analyses about this upcoming election. I know you will, as I am, be closely watching in the next less than 2 weeks. November 1st is the election, and usually takes a little while before we get the results out. Give a quick plug. Rory and I are going to write a piece for Journal of Democracy on this election, and in fast pace of academic time, it'll probably be available to read in April. But in any way, it was great to hear from all of you. Thanks, Max, to EGAP for hosting this, and look forward to speaking with you all again soon.
Yeah, I wanted to thank everybody once again. That's great. And I wanted to get Evan's predictions because we didn't get yours.
Yeah, well, my predictions are that it's going to vary a lot. No, just kidding. It's lots of locals, 257 local elections. You know, one of the things that I found in the last election is that everywhere that the ANC had previously done very well, it did worse, and vice versa. And so, you know, I do think that when I start looking at the patterns of South African elections, that there's a tendency for this, you know, back and forth swing. And so my guess is that we will see again a little bit of that reversal, because everyone's a bit unhappy, and that unhappiness translate into, you know, on the margin, some reversals, but that on balance nationally will probably wind up with, you know, pretty similar low 50% for the ANC nationwide. And I think that at least compared to 2019, you know, I would think that participation is going to go up a little bit, because I think that there's a lot of energy around these elections. But of course, COVID could stand in the way, but I don't think it's going to. But that's my prediction. I laid out there, could be very wrong.
Well, we'll have to see on November 1st. Thank you guys for this great discussion. Evan, Rory, Hugo, Tshegofatso, thank you all once again. And yeah, that's it for this edition of EGAP's election series.